Welcome back to the Bible in Context,
where context is king and the original author's intent drives our interpretation.
It's been a while since we've said that.
I know. It feels like it's been forever since we've sat down to record anything.
I know it's been, a week for you guys, but yeah, we recorded a lot of the stuff with Aaron Sherwood, kind of in a couple conversations, and then Phil, and so we took a couple months off, and it was nice, actually.
It's good to be back, though.
It is. Yeah, I've missed doing it. All right, so we're going to jump into Ephesians.
Yes, we have been talking about doing this series for a long time.
Yeah, and then we put Galatians there in the middle and completely stalled it. So
yeah,
and we've been talking about doing the minor prophets for longer.
That is true, or we still haven't got there.
Yeah, that's hopefully next.
That will be a bigger challenge for me. Ephesians I've studied. The minor prophets I have not dove into many of the book of the 12.
I think it's going to be a fun one, though, because I think it's going to put a lot of rubber to the road on principles we've talked about in the past.
Right.
That's part of why we're doing Ephesians, too.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, and before we dive into Ephesians here, if there are any other books that you want us to dive into or any other topics, send them in the email, and we'll pick those up either between Ephesians and the minor prophets or after the minor prophets, depending on what the request is. Let us know what questions you have and what you're interested in. We want to try and create a comprehensive resource here. Speaking of that, we need to create a place, I think, to put some categories of episodes. And like, if we didn't we've talked about before, if you want a podcast on Genesis, come here. If you want something on Exodus, go to Carmen Imes. If you want something on Revelation or Romans, go to Matt Halstead. We need to put something together, I feel like, because that's what we want to do, is create a good comprehensive audio resource to just understand your Bible while you're, commuting or something, or mowing the grass. I don't know, whatever you do.
Right. Yeah, I think that'd be super helpful.
Okay, so send those in if you got them. We'll try to come up with a resource, kind of organization tool at some point in the future, one day, maybe. So Ephesians, why are we doing Ephesians?
Yeah, great question. I mean, I think, to me, Ephesians is such a critical book because it helps us to, I think, better understand assuming that Paul wrote it. It helps us to understand Paul's theology. More than likely, it was written not just to Ephesus, but to numerous churches. And so it gives us a lot of background about what he was dealing with and what the church was dealing with in that day. And I think it also, there's a lot in here that is still, especially in the last 500 years, has become controversial. And so it's good for us to wrestle with some of the more controversial stuff too, and try to maybe help us better understand what it means, like those scary terms like predestination and election.
We'll hit all those fun topics. The next, first chapter is all about that. So We'll get to tackle that topic. And I think, like you just said, as we're coming out of Genesis and we have the Old Testament story fresh in our minds, we've also kind of discussed the canon as well. So we kind of have an idea of what the purpose of these letters are a little better. And so, how do we come to this with an Old Testament mindset? Because the context for Paul is not, 500 years ago, a Reformation necessarily, not to say they got everything wrong. And we may discover they got some things right. But Paul was thinking as a first century Jew with the Old Testament promises and hopes and narratives in his head.
Right. And so we typically, when we think our theological grid that we grew up with, most of us here, in our culture at least, we're very hyper individualistic. And so it's about God and me, and I've messed up and broken my relationship with God, and he sent his son for me, and it's very individualized. And so Paul, I think, thought about salvation, and his whole theological grid was much more nuanced.
Yeah, it was. And so that's kind of our reason. Broad scope, we mentioned a few things there, but broad scope, that's why we're doing this letter. It's rich. There's a lot to dig into it. It's going to make a lot of the typological threads that we've mentioned already from Genesis, and a lot of the principles for reading your Bible, they're really going to come into practice in this letter. And then also it's going to teach us a lot about Paul's theology, because it is more of a general letter, like you were saying. It probably was circulated around multiple churches. So this will give us kind of his broad scope. If you were to run into Paul on the street, what might he tell you about the gospel?
Yeah. I think this is a good summary of his theology.
Yeah. And some of the biggest points he wants to make. Okay, so let's talk a little bit, though, about you just mentioned if Paul's the author. So let's talk about that a little bit, because we mentioned this a bit during the canon series. But we just want to, again, this is one of those dry topics that I think most people, especially in a confessional, with a confessional background, you want to skip that part of the commentary where they talk about this and just say Paul wrote it and that's it. And ultimately, I think Paul wrote it, but I think it's worth wrestling with these issues.
So do you think he wrote it by himself?
No,
Okay.
Probably not. He probably had a team. So again, go back to like our episodes on the New Testament writing, and he probably had like an amanuensis. He's not sitting there at the Rembrandt painting, sitting there writing the letters down. He's walking around, talking this out. Somebody's jotting down notes, and they compile it into a coherent letter. All the team,
and they're crafting it.
Yeah,
like I kind of look at it. There's a lot of songwriters these days that they'll have a team around them as they're crafting a song, and they'll bounce ideas off of each other. And so you've got a main author or writer, but then you've got a whole team of people that are helping you craft it into what we see here. And I don't think that lessens the inspiration of it. And again, we can go back to the conversations we've had in the past about that.
Yeah, exactly. I think actually just a metaphor that, an experience that we probably all have that might help is just, the other day I was at work and told one of my coworkers, hey, we need to send this email that has this point, and this point sent in it. And then another coworker says, actually, we need this as well. Oh yeah, that's a good point. Throw that in there as well. Then later, the one who's writing the email comes back to me and says, hey, here's the email. Is this what you want to send? I say, edit this and this looks good. All right, send it. That's what Paul did pretty much.
Good deal.
So, all right. So did Paul write it or not? So typically there's the argument that this letter is pseudepigraphal. That's where a lot of scholars will come down saying that he didn't write it. Again, pseudepigraphal means false writing, falsely attributed. So it means that the person who claims to have written it didn't actually write it. And so part of their argument goes that the letter seems very impersonal, and so it doesn't seem that he has a specific audience in mind. They also talk about the fact that there is different language and different style found in Ephesians. And with that, there's apparently 41 unique words to the letter. They also point to the fact that there's a lot of repeated phrases from Colossians or possible dependence on Colossians and Ephesians. So whoever wrote this may have sat down with the book of Colossians and, kind of copied some ideas and some things over. But really, none of these are very strong arguments. So there's actually, I mentioned there's 41 unique words in this letter. There's also 35 unique words in the shorter letter of Galatians, which everybody generally accepts as being from Paul. Also, if someone's writing letters to different situations for different purposes, we would expect some unique phrases, some unique words, depending on what their purpose is in this letter versus this one over here. That's just natural human communication. That depends on Colossians. Well, yeah, sure. If he has some good ideas in Colossians, like if I sit down to write, if you and I are writing a sermon or writing these notes or whatever, if we had a good idea somewhere else, maybe we're going to go borrow from ourselves again.
Oh, yeah.
Why not?
Yeah.
Do you ever copy from old sermons or,
Well, yeah, especially if I'm preaching at another church. It's very common for me to take an old sermon and refresh it, depending on who I'm talking to. But
and someone will come along in 100 years and say, no, that was Perry. And just, anyway. So yeah, that's perfectly expected for Paul to use his own words from elsewhere in another letter and to use unique words because he also uses unique words in other letters that are not doubted. And as far as the general audience, well, again, this was very possibly a circular letter supposed to go around to multiple churches, despite the note of 2 Ephesians in the beginning of the letter.
Didn't some of the earlier manuscripts have a blank?
They did. Yeah. And so it just said, to the faithful ones to Christ Jesus, rather than to the
church in Ephesus.
To the church in Ephesus who are faithful. And so it does seem like, and this is coming from O'Brien in the Pillar Commentary series, but he sees that and this is from a lot of commentators, but they will see if you take in Ephesus out, the language works, but it seems awkward. The address of to the Ephesians seems to be required, as though maybe that was the original recipients, or it could be that multiple copies were made and different names in different cities were filled in. Who knows? Or maybe it wasn't there at all. So, but just based on the general audience within the letter, and given that little discrepancy of like, is this to Ephesians or not? Because some older manuscripts don't have any title of where it's going to. They think this was probably a circular letter.
Right. Well, and the fact that he doesn't really address any specific issues going on in Ephesus, like he does in Galatia, like in his other letters. Yeah, Corinthians, there's very specific things that he is addressing to that particular church. There's nothing like that.
Yeah, this is a very broad scope of here's the hope of the Jewish people, and you Gentiles are brought into it. And here's, it's very general as to how Paul sees the gospel. And that's another reason why we're wanting to cover this letter.
Absolutely.
And so also, just again, one more point about the authorship is this letter has quotes from Clement of Rome, which was in 95 CE, also from Polycarp, And according to Tertullian, Marcion saw this letter as being authentic. And so we have quotes of this letter by 95 CE. So that means this letter must have been very early, so very probably within Paul's lifetime.
So do we want to talk a little bit more about the audience? I'm assuming like at least Ephesus is one of the churches that he's writing to, some of the things that they were dealing with, and also the other churches around that area. So we've been actually going through a sermon series on Sunday mornings at Mercy Hill on Revelation. And so we've done quite a bit of research into the 7 churches in Revelation, which were in Asia Minor, and Ephesus was one of those churches. And so I feel like we have a pretty good grasp on some of the things that they were being challenged with. They had pressure to abandon their faith from multiple different directions. Of course, you've got the pagan worshipers in Ephesus, especially. They were known for the temple to Artemis.
And you see a lot of these problems in the books to Timothy, the letters to Timothy, because he's a pastor in Ephesus. But again, you don't get a lot of that in Ephesians because, again, I think this is a more general letter meant to go to other places. What we're really going to see more of in this letter, and we're going to get into an outline here in just a few minutes of what just a short outline of what this letter is about, but it's more about, again, the hope of the Jews, the Gentiles being brought in, and now that you are part of this new nation, this new Israel under Jesus, what are you supposed to be? How are you supposed to be living?
Right. So you've got the context of like the pagan worshipers. You've got the context of also the imperial cult that was big back then. And then you've got the Jews that were not converts that were often throwing the Christians under the bus and trying to accuse them of all sorts of things so that Rome would do what they did to Jesus. And then in the midst of all that, you're right, you've got this division within the church between the Jewish converts and the Gentile converts. And that's primarily what he's addressing.
And I think you see actually that happen all over in the book of Acts because, he goes to the Jews first in each city and then to the Gentiles. And so I think that's why you do see this emphasis on how do the Jews relate to the Gentiles in this letter, even though it's more general, because that's a problem that he has to address probably in every church that he's established.
Yeah. Well, we saw it in the church in...
Yeah, there it was turned up to 10.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's a very similar problem that he faced in Galatia. But again, it just seems more general. And that makes sense here because since he went to the Jews and then the Gentiles in every city he went to in Acts, this is probably an issue that he needs to at least address to make sense of among the churches in every place that he went to evangelize.
Right. Well, and for Paul, I mean, he's been assigned by God this mission to be an apostle to the Gentiles and really to bring these two groups together. And I remember when I was preaching through this, I gave the illustration, we're in Kentucky, and so I gave the illustration of this be kind of like if you were on the staff of the University of Louisville and the governor of Kentucky asked you to merge those two, the University of Louisville and the University of Kentucky together as one. I mean, these are rivals.
Yeah.
And so to try to merge two rival parties together, I can't even imagine all the challenges.
Depending where you were, it was not safe to wear a UK hoodie at U of L.
Right.
There, so.
Right. Yeah. I think what Paul was dealing with, it's 10 times what it would be to try to merge those two universities together. You're trying to merge two different worldviews together.
Yeah. So I think we're kind of hinting at this already, what our thoughts are. But when Paul sat down to write this letter, what was in his mind? I think what we often assume is Paul had a list of theological truths that he wanted to communicate, and so he wrote this letter to do that. This is his way of communicating a laundry list of systematic theology entries. That's how he wrote the letter, right?
Yeah, we often think that way.
That's how I was taught to read it. Maybe more so implicitly, but...
Right. But that could be, that's not anywhere close to what he would have had in his mind. He would have had a story, I think, in his mind.
Yes.
That goes all the way back to creation, really. He's got the whole story of the Israelites and the Old Testament and the Exodus and the exile and everything, all of that is in his head.
And his audience as well. They know the Old Testament stories, the Old Testament hopes. And so he's trying to say, okay, now that Jesus has come as the fulfillment of all this, how do we fit into that story?
Right.
Where does this make sense? And also, what does this mean for the exact shape at this moment in time of our hope? And so I want to extend this story into the post-Jesus era. How does it make sense today?
How do we fit into this story? And I think, that's what I think he's thinking of as he's writing this, is like, how do we, the church, fit into God's grand narrative right now? And what's our role, too?
Yeah, so have a story in your mind, not a list of truths. think, how do we fit into this narrative? And that's what he's going to do, is he's going to extend the Old Testament hopes and stories into what Jesus has done, and then also give some practical implications of exhortations about how do we live out this story.
Right.
So, all right. So with that, should we kind of jump into an outline of the whole book?
Yeah, for sure. So split into two sections, right? Two primary sections, first half and second half. And how would you describe the first half versus the second half?
So yeah, this book is kind of split into halves. And what I would say is the first section of the book, this actually kind of fits into the short outline that I had. I kind of could condense the book into one sentence, and then I'm going to talk about kind of each chapter, how they fit into this shorter outline. So basically the first half of the book is Paul saying, Jesus has been exalted as the King of all, and he's the Jewish Messiah. You Gentiles have been welcomed into this. And so we are now a new unified nation. And so the second half of the book is him giving a lot more exhortations and instructions on, therefore, be unified. Here's how to be, some practical
This is what it looks
advice
like.
about what it means to be unified.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, so the first three chapters are a lot of theology. The last three chapters are a lot of application.
Yeah. Which, again, it all centers around, like, the Jewish Messiah has come. You Gentiles have been brought into that. Therefore, be unified.
Yeah.
That's kind of the two halves that we see, is that therefore be unified is the second half. So, all right, we start off in chapter 1. I'm just going to go through and talk about, like, a sentence or two for each chapter. And we'll mention these again as we go through the chapters and kind of make sense of this. Because I want us to have, start with a very simple, big picture, and then be able to narrow down until we understand this book from the top down to a granular level. And that way we can just think like Paul as we're reading this. So, again, in chapter 1, he talks about, ye have obtained blessing in the exaltation of Jesus as the fulfillment of the Old Testament promises and the fulfillment of God's intentions ever since he created the world, finally making that unified nation under God. That's what Adam and Eve were supposed to be. Didn't work out. Jesus has done that. By the way, you Gentiles, you have a share in this as well. That's a lot of what chapter 1 is about. And then in verse 15, he starts into this prayer for their understanding of this king that has come. And so in chapter 2, he kind of reiterates this and talks about, we Jews, we apostles, we were dead, but made alive. Also, God gave the gift of making you alive along with us for good works. And so you also now share in this new life and in the citizenship of the household of God, in the kingdom of God. So there's a lot in the first couple chapters of, hey, we Jews, our deliverance has finally come, and you guys got to come in as well. That's a lot of what he's doing there. And it's really cool the way that he kind of does this bait and switch with, like, we Jews got this, we Jews got this, we Jews have this, and then also you Gentiles. So it's kind of, I think it's really clever the way he did this. So in chapter 3, he begins talking about the fact that he is in prison, so he is a shamed ambassador by the honor system of the world. But he's an ambassador because God told him to, and he is honored in God's honor system. He is not to be shamed, and so they shouldn't be looking down on Paul just because he's a Roman prisoner, because he is God's ambassador. And he is an ambassador in part so that the powers that be, that the powers and principalities, the spiritual beings that are rebelled to Jesus, they will be defeated and see their defeat by Jesus. And so again, he prays that they would understand the breadth of what Jesus has done and the cosmic scope of it. So in chapter 4, he begins talking about, because of the greatness of this message and the calling that it entails, he encourages them to strive for unity among this new kingdom, to seek unifying traits, and to keep one another from being led astray. And so he begins in verse 14 to have this kind of list of, don't be like this, be like this. Here are some traits that are bad. Here are some traits that are going to keep you unified and to help them maintain a spirit of unity among God's people. In chapter 5, he really does the same thing. He gives another list of, don't be like this, be like this. He gives warnings about wickedness and tells them, be filled with the joy in what Jesus has accomplished and submit to one another. So again, just more unity language. And then he talks about in verse 22, that's where we're going to get into some really fun stuff with, the role of men and women and family dynamics and things like that. But he talks about some common relationships where you might have disunity and gives instructions on how to be mutually submissive and unified in a Christ-like way. And then in chapter 6, that's the famous armor of God passage. We'll talk about that as well. And that's where he's basically saying, be equipped with assurance and practice the truth and use that truth to fight temptation, which would lead to disunity. And also spread the kingdom. Also pray for one another and pray for Paul to, evangelize and spread the kingdom as well. Then verse 21, he says, peace, in apostolic fashion, just a goodbye, sign off, and that's kind of the end of the letter. But, I mean, unity runs all throughout this letter. That is the thrust, I think.
Well, and I think, yeah, it's at the heart of the letter too, literally at the heart of the letter. The first 3 chapters are one big chiasm, right? And so it starts with a song, ends with, at the end of the 3rd chapter, ends with a song. And then sandwiched in between the 2 songs, you've got 2 prayers. After the first song, there's a prayer. Right before the last song, there's a prayer. And then in between those prayers and songs, you've got the meat of the theological section of the letter, and at the very center of the meat, you've got in chapter 2. I'll start in verse 19 and go down to verse 22. It says, "So then, you Gentiles are no longer strangers and aliens, but you are fellow citizens with the saints, members of the household of God, built on the foundation of the apostles and the prophets, Christ Jesus himself being the cornerstone, in whom the whole structure being joined together grows into a holy temple in the Lord. In him you also are being built together into a dwelling place for God by the Spirit." And so that's the center point, the pinnacle of the chiasm, and I really think it shows the heartbeat of the whole letter.
Yeah, it really is. I mean, at the chiastic center, and just, I mean, you circulate around it the whole letter. So unity, I think, is at the heart. And something I think is really interesting is that in our context, I think you would have to make a good, detailed argument for why does unity make sense? Why do we have to care?
Right.
But what Paul does throughout this letter, and we're going to see this, is he says, hey, you guys are part of a new kingdom, therefore be unified. There's no steps in between that he really details out. It seems like his audience will understand. If they are part of the same nation, they should be unified.
Right.
They don't have to. So he spends more time making the case of, like, you're a new nation, here's how to be unified, not you're a new nation, so you should be unified. It seems that that's just assumed.
Right.
And I think they have a different understanding of family dynamics, what it means to be a people, and how they're supposed to just interrelate.
Right. Yeah.
So we have to make the argument for we should be unified, because it'd be a lot easier if I could just go home and shut my door and just be entertained by my TV alone and never talk to people again. That's what we all kind of gravitate towards. I think a lot of us see the value in relationship, but we just don't often put feet to it.
It's true. Yeah. Yeah. Our culture very often encourages us in small ways to isolate ourselves.
Yeah. And so it's good just to recognize that Paul has that not as something he's teaching, but something he's assuming. And so we need to try to put ourselves in the same mindset, to have a very similar understanding of what it means to be a nation and what it means to be unified.
Right.
As God's nation. So, all right, we are going to pick up in chapter 1 next time. How quick do you think we're going to make it through this letter?
It depends on how much we talk.
Well, yeah, thanks. That's Captain Obvious. I have no idea how long this is going to take us. We have a lot of notes. We don't want to be too granular. It's a podcast, not a commentary. But we also want to get down to the details. So we're going to go through this, and we will just keep doing it until we're done.
Sounds like a plan.
So we'll pick up next time with Ephesians chapter 1.